one of the themes to begin this NBA season has certainly been teams that are a disaster. The Brooklyn Nets, although they've turned it around a little bit recently, looked awful to begin the season. The Lakers continue to look like a bit of a disaster with LeBron now injured. They're starting to win some games, but of course, given the future assets that both Brooklyn and LA owe to these other teams, things aren't looking good for them. But the one team that is being overlooked as an NBA disaster right now is the Chicago Bulls. And they're checking every single box in the potential NBA disaster category, and it needs to be discussed. Now, what's interesting about Chicago is at this time last season, they were one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. At one point last year, they were the 1 seed. They were, 10 games over 500 in the beginning of the season. And all these different moves that they'd made, where they bring in DeMar DeRozan, they bring in Lonzo Ball, they bring in Alex Caruso. The year prior, they bring in Nikola Vucevic. They didn't go all in, but they definitely made some win now moves to try and put together a competitive roster. This time a year ago, all of those things looked really good. They had this exciting team that was guarding. They were getting turnovers. They were playing in transition. They had multiple different offensive outlets. DeMar DeRozan looked like an MVP candidate. And now, like I said, things are a bit of a disaster for Chicago. And there's so many different angles to go here in terms of how they got here, what they could possibly do in the future. But I feel like to pay off the title of the video and the concept of the video, I have to explain to you why exactly this is such a disaster for Chicago. The biggest issue here is there isn't really a way out. So they owe 2 future first round picks still. They owe Orlando their pick in 2023 as a result of the Nikola Vucevic trade, and they owe San Antonio a top 10 protected pick in 2025 as a result of the DeMar DeRozan trade. Now, like I said, it's a top 10 protected pick in 2025, not a super big deal, and I think the 2023 is top 4 protected. But even if they don't end up giving up those picks and they get pushed down the road, maybe they give up 2 seconds, not having that ability to trade those future picks when you're a team like Chicago is a massive deal because they actually don't have a ton of other assets on the roster. I don't think anybody's really excited about Patrick Williams right now. I don't really think anybody's super excited about trading for Nikola Vucevic on an expiring contract. Kobe White is not really that big of a trade asset. Lonzo Ball, not really that big of a trade asset. And the only guy they really have that I feel like other teams would be significantly interested in would be Zach LaVine. Now, you might say, oh, well, what about DeMar DeRozan? Well, he's getting older. His game is everything has to revolve around him. Not that teams wouldn't be interested in DeMar, but the top level asset is certainly Zach LaVine. The problem for LaVine is he hasn't looked that good this year. He doesn't look particularly healthy to me. We know he was dealing with some injury stuff to begin the season, and he just does not look like he has that same kind of athleticism. He's getting benched at the end of games. Players are unhappy with Bill Donovan. They're multiple games under 500. They had expectations of being a pretty good team in the East this year, and everything is just kind of falling apart around them, and it really feels like there isn't an out. Like, if you just put yourself in the shoes of the general manager of the Chicago Bulls right now, right? Like, you've made these moves over the last couple of seasons. You tanked for 5 years, not this GM, but the prior GM did. They changed things up, but the franchise as a whole tanked for years and years and years. They trade Jimmy Butler a handful of years ago, and they win, between 23 and 30 games for basically 5 years in a row. And they continually get like the 5th pick in the draft, the 8th pick in the draft, the 9th pick in the draft. They're never bad enough to really get a true superstar. The LaVine thing works out as a result of the Jimmy Butler trade, and you finally get a chance last year. You're like 27-13 to begin the season last year, and you make these all-in moves in the prior offseason, getting Vucevic the prior year, getting DeRozan the prior offseason, and now you're in a situation where you're just not going anywhere. What do? You owe 2 future first-round picks. Your best trade asset, Zach LaVine, the best young player on your roster, is not playing particularly well and doesn't look super healthy. That's going to be low value in exchange for Zach LaVine compared to what you could have gotten for him in the offseason. You just signed him to this big extension. One of the most critical players on your team is Lonzo Ball, who knows if he's ever going to be healthy ever again, and if it's going to be this season, it's going to be months from now. DeMar DeRozan is your other best player. He's getting older. Again, trade value is certainly not there. Vucevic, I don't think anybody cares about. Like, we just went over this. What do? Do you just trade Zach LaVine and try and get some value, even though his value is lower now than it's ever been, arguably, as a result of the health stuff in the contract? Do you continue to go all in and make some moves, trade some future first, trade Kobe White, trade Patrick Williams, try and shuffle the roster around in a way that makes a little bit more sense? Where do you go from here? Because on paper, everything that was good about Chicago last year is still there. They have 2 fantastic perimeter scorers and playmakers and creators in LaVine and DeRozan. They have, some defensive-minded players that help them guard a little bit. They're actually pretty good in terms of defensive rating this year. They're top half of the league. Caruso, Lonzo, if he was healthy, Patrick Williams can still guard a little bit. You've got a third option offensively in Nikola Vucevic. A lot of the things that made this team good last year are still there. They're just not playing as well. I think Lonzo is a huge connective piece for them. As good as Ayo Dosunmu is, he's not as good as Lonzo would be, and it limits their depth, and they don't actually have as many really solid NBA players as you'd want them to have, and their spacing is not very good. They're not a very good offensive team, and there just doesn't appear to be a clear solution. And so where all this is leading to me is it's time to make some choices. Now I understand it's only, less than 20 games into the season. There's still a lot of time for them to change some things up, make some roster moves. I understand that. But when you're a team that owes 2 future first round picks, when you're a team that is multiple games under 500, when you're a team that even when fully healthy and fully clicking probably isn't a contender, you need to do one of two things. You either need to go further all in and try and fix it. Maybe you move Patrick Williams, maybe try and get some more spacing on the team, maybe try and get something in exchange for Vucevic as an expiring contract, or you need to start tearing some things down. You need to try and get a top 4 pick in this upcoming draft. That would completely change their franchise rather than possibly giving away a lottery pick again to Orlando. That top 4 protection is huge on that pick this upcoming season. You need to make sure that you retain that top 10 protected pick in 2025 as well. You need to go back to the 20 to 30 win Chicago Bulls that you were for 4 or 5 seasons. And it's unfortunate because a lot of the guys that were on those teams that they tanked for are playing pretty well. Like Wendell Carter Jr., we've talked about this in a previous video. Wendell Carter Jr. is good for Orlando. He's a better player, would be a better fit on this roster right now than Nikola Vucevic is. And they gave up 2 future first round picks in addition to Wendell Carter to get Vucevic. Lauri Markkanen's playing out of his mind for Utah. They let him go in exchange for basically nothing to Cleveland. Now he's in Utah. He's playing incredibly well. And it's just a really unfortunate situation as a Bulls fan because you probably felt like, okay, we made it. We made the right moves. We brought in guys we needed to bring in. We were super aggressive. We're 27-13 or whatever they were to begin the year last year. And now there's just no real future for this group. And it's unfortunate because I think Zach LaVine has been unbelievable for them as a franchise over the last couple of seasons, going through all the losing and dealing with everything that he's had to deal with from an injury standpoint. And right when you felt like he was going to get an opportunity to be a big time player, it's just all falling apart for them. And so that goes back to the premise that I mentioned at the beginning. Like, what do you do? If you guys watching this video, like what would your plan be? What would your move be? To me, I would try and wait it out, see if you can change some things with the rotation and maybe start to play better, make some more shots. Depending on what the intel is on Lonzo, if he comes back again, I think he's a huge connective piece. But if you get 30 games into the year and you're 10 games under 500 and Zach LaVine starts to look healthier and look a little bit better, I'd seriously explore trading away Zach LaVine, trying to get a top 4 pick in this upcoming draft and just moving on by trading away the veterans, getting rid of Vucevic, getting rid of DeRozan eventually, and seeing what you can get for Patrick Williams and just break the whole thing down. Because there's, like I said, if you're going to try and go even more all in, you have to consolidate the young players. You have to trade Kobe White, you have to trade Patrick Williams, you have to trade future firsts, and there's just no real indication on this roster that they're ever going, even with those additions, they're ever going to be better than or as good as Boston, Milwaukee, some of the better teams, even in their conference, much less the entire league. And that to me is why this is kind of a disaster situation, because it's easy for me to stand here and say, oh, they should trade LaVine, they should do this and that if they're where they are, 30 games into the year. It's much, much more difficult to actually do that in practice, and it's unrealistic to do that in practice given what they invested in terms of losing for years and years and years. So they're probably not going to do that, and they're going to continue to stay the course and just be an okay team and start giving away lottery picks to Orlando or potentially San Antonio in 2025. Now, if they were to go the route of trading away Zach LaVine, where would they look? I think New York is always a team to keep an eye on when it comes to big time trades like this, and I don't know what exactly they would expect to get back because RJ Barrett's not playing particularly well for New York, but they have plenty of future first round picks, and if you are able to do like RJ and 2 firsts in exchange for Zach LaVine, that's not the worst trade package you could possibly get. Again, I think when you're dealing with a guy that just signed this big extension and health is a little bit of a concern for him right now, you can't necessarily expect to get a ton of fantastic assets in exchange, but it's just kind of the situation you're in where maybe you do need to look at trading away a guy like LaVine. DeRozan, you can of course look at either the LA teams possibly in terms of moving him. I still think some teams might be interested in Patrick Williams, potentially teams that need front court help, but really I think what this comes down to is I'm not necessarily saying that Chicago ruined this. Like, I think the Vucevic trade, albeit a negative trade now in hindsight, was a decent gamble. Like, it was a decent idea to try and make that move, and maybe it ultimately led to bringing in DeRozan. Every move they made has been defensible. The problem is they just didn't get lucky enough, quite frankly. Like, the Kobe White, the Lauri Markkanen, and ultimately Patrick Williams, like, they kind of had that like Orlando Magic juju on them, where they're like just outside of where all the really good players are in the draft, and they're always just outside of the top 5. Or in Patrick Williams' case, that was a 3-player draft. No one knew who was going to go 4, and Patrick Williams has just not panned out the way that they hoped that he would. And if you go and look at the rosters of the past 5 years for Chicago, you're going to see a lot of 7 overall, 8 overall, 9 overall picks, and unfortunately you might get one of those correct on occasion and get this superstar guy in that like 8 to 13 range, but it's just much more likely when you're in the top 5 or when you're in the top 3, and Chicago just never found themselves there. And it's a weird situation because oftentimes when teams fall apart like this, like I'm really passionate about, oh well, they screwed this up, they did this wrong. Like, so for example, like Minnesota, like I hate the Gobert trade. I think it set them back, and that was very clearly a mistake even in the moment. The Vucevic thing I think is probably the biggest blunder here, but again, defensible in the moment. Wendell Carter Jr. didn't play for them. He was never healthy. The 2 future first round picks was not really that big of a deal, and maybe it ultimately led to some more positive things for them. So I'm not like mad or upset that they like ruined this and they're this massive disaster as a result of that. They're more so just a disaster because things didn't quite work out. And then once they made their all-in moves, they kind of hit their peak and are now falling back down on the other side of the mountain. And I just don't know that there's a way to recover this current roster into something even remotely resembling a contender. They are way closer to a lottery team right now than one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. And that is a scary place to be for a team that doesn't really have any reinforcements coming. I mean, if you want to count on Lonzo turning back into exactly who he was before these injury issues in a couple of months, sure. But like, this is pretty much the team right now. I know guys miss games on occasion and Levine's not playing particularly well, but this is pretty much the team. And if they can't turn it around, we could be looking at some very significant changes in Chicago this season.